So in this video, we're going to walk you through how to set up server-side GTM on Azure. There are a few requirements that we need first. We need an Azure account, which we already have set up. We need a custom domain or subdomain, which in this case, we're going to be using our consulting company's domain, pinemarsh.com, and it's going to be metrics.pinemarsh.com. We need an SSL certificate to set up HTTPS. And finally, we need server-side container for GTM. We are going to need a server-side container for GTM. You go to the drop-down, you create the container, which you're going to do, and you specify that you want a server-side instrumentation and measurement. Let's call it PineMarsh, current one, pinemarsh.com. It's going to be the name of our container. It's going to be this. We're going to create a container. But the difference is that now he's going to ask us how to provision, and we're going to say that we want to manually provision the tagging server. And we need to save this container config. We're going to have to use it at a later date to set things up in Azure. So just copy that and store in a safe place. Container config. And now we go back to Azure. When setting up GTM server side in Azure, or to be fair, in any other cloud platform, which includes Google Clouds, you're always setting up two servers, minimum. The first is a preview server, and the second one is the actual tagging server. Now, the preview server is only one instance. It does not need auto-scaling. In fact, the best practices from Google indicate you should not have auto-scaling, and it does not need to be under the custom domain. It does require, however, to be under HTTPS. The tagging server can be one or more. In fact, best practices is it should be at least two. It can auto-scale. It should auto-scale in some cases. And it doesn't need to be under a custom domain, but it should be under a custom domain so that you can benefit from first-party cookies. So we are in Azure now. So first things first, let's set up a resource group so that we can neatly pack things up into our Azure account. So we are going to go to resource groups and we're going to create a new resource group. So we have a resource group, which we can call SGTM. And our region is not the US. We are in Europe. Specifically, we are in the UK. So UK South. And we don't have tags to put here, so you can just review it and create. And the validation has passed, so you can create. So now you have a resource group so that everything we create in Azure, we can assign to this resource group, and it basically is a way for us to make sure that things are all packaged. So to set up server-side GTM on Azure, we will need to set up two virtual machines. One for the preview server and a second one for the tagging server. Now, they're in Azure, they are app services. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to create a new app service. And that app service is going to load a Docker image, the GTM Docker image from Google, and we're going to deploy both of our services. So for reference, the Docker image we're interested in is this one from the Google Cloud Registry Service, which is the GTM Cloud Image Stable. So we will go to the app services and we're going to create a web app. We'll specify our previously created resource group. And now we'll specify that the name from this is preview server. Now we want to use a container. It's Linux. And our region for us is going to be UK South. For you, it might be a different region. And we keep going. And now I already have a plan set up. But if you want to create a new plan, you can go here and select a new instance. The instance we're going to be doing here for the preview is the B1. It's a very small instance. And given that the preview server isn't called often, it's enough for our requirements. The second step we need is to go to the container. And here we need to be a little bit careful. Step number one is the image source is either Docker Hub or other registries. It's a single container. Access type is public, but now we need to be careful. We need to pick up this part, the clouds tagging, and do the image tag. And this part over here, we need to override this. The reason for this is that this is the default registry server for Docker Hub, and we technically want the registry server for the Google images. So this is going to be gcr.io. If you don't do this, the deployment will fail because Azure will not be able to collect the Docker image. But now that we have this, we're ready to go through the review and create. There's some validations that are going to occur now, and we can go ahead and create. Now, essentially what Azure is doing now is doing all of the deployment for this virtual machine. It's basically making sure that all of the resources are allocated and downloading the Docker container and installing it. And this might take a bit of time. Once that's done, we need to do some configuration. And in particular, we need to configure the environment variables. This will tell the container how to act. Do we want it to act as the preview server or do we want it to act as a tag server? In our case, in this particular case, we want it to act as a preview server. So there's some small setup. We'll add an environment variable called as preview server, and this will be set to true. And we apply. And the second variable is container config, which we're going to set to the container config string we got from Google Tag Manager previously. And we apply. And once we apply, he's going to warn us that he's going to restart the app, which we are okay with. Save changes, your app may restart, confirm. At this point, we need to set up the health check. The health check is to make sure that your service is running. The way we do that is we go to the health check on the monitoring, we click enable, and we set it to the health Z path, which is a previous service path for the health check, and we save. Now, if we go back to the previous server, to the overview, we will see that it's currently showing as degraded. Now, the health check is happening every so often, and it will take a little bit of time, 5 to 10 minutes, for your Docker image to be set up. So just hit the refresh button and you'll see this go from degraded to healthy. Alternatively, you also can have a look at the deployment logs where you can actually see inside of the Docker image what's happening. And at the moment, we can see that the container is being created. For the previous server, you don't need auto scaling. It should be pinned as one app. In fact, that's a recommended setting from Google themselves. We will need to save this default domain, which is the URL for the previous server, because we're going to need it to set up the tagging server. And the tagging server is set up in much of the same steps as the previous server, except one environment variable is different. So let's get to it. We'll create another web app, assign it to the resource group. This is the tagging server. It's also a container. In fact, it's the same container. We'll select UK South. And here I set up a Linux plan, which is an S1 server. For my needs, it's enough. You need to scale this accordingly for your use case. And again, on the container side, we'll go here, Docker Hub or other registries, single container, public access. And again, don't forget to take this gcr.io and replace this docker.io with the gcr.io. And the image slash tag is going to be this piece where we're done. Review and create. Now we wait a bit and we now create. As you can see, the process is fairly similar. Where we're going to have to do a slight change is on the configuration. So let's go to the resource. And once we're in the resource, let's have a look at the environment variables. One of them is exactly the same as the previous server, which is the container configuration. So container config, we need this configuration string and we apply. The difference between this and the previous server is that in the tagging server, you specify as an environment variable the previous server URL, which we saved in the previous step. And this URL does not need to be under your custom domain. The previous server can sit on Azure. What needs to sit on your custom domain to take advantage of first-party cookie tracking is the tagging server. Now we hit apply, we hit confirm, and we also need to set up the health check, which is the same way. We go to health check, you enable health check, and the path is exactly the same. And we save. Now, you're also going to get this degraded here. It's going to be the same thing. It should take about 5 to 10 minutes to set up. While we're working on this, we can also have a look at auto scaling. So in my particular use case, I don't need a lot of scale, but you might need auto scaling. What is auto scaling? Auto scaling means that if your site traffic and the number of events increases significantly, the number of instances will increase instead of just crashing. And this is one of the great advantages of setting up on Google Cloud Run. This is done for you by default. So to do this, you will go on the scale out and you will want a rules, in our case, we want a rules-based scaling where we want a custom autoscaler. We want to do it based on a metric. And in our case, I already had some rules that are defined. So we scale out by 1 instance when average CPU percentage is greater than 70. And we scale back in, i.e. we cut the count when the average CPU percentage is below 70. We have a minimum of 2 instances. We have a maximum of 3, and our default is 2. And for my purposes, this is enough, but you need to adjust this accordingly to your purposes. An alternative way of doing the health check and making sure that everything is set up correctly is to grab the URL itself. And once you open this URL, you should get a not found. And if you check the health Zs, you should get an OK. And this tells us that our previous server is correctly set up. And finally, there's another way to test. Let's save the URL for the tagging server. And the trick is, we'll go back to GTM and we need to add the URL in the server container configuration. Admin in container settings. We'll then add the URL. This is for our tagging server. And eventually we also need to add our own custom domain, but for now we'll just add this one. We'll save. And now we can get back here and we can preview. And now if we open the container server URL again and add a /test to the path, we should get a 400 HTTP error. Because that's the error when you don't have any clients listening. Let's open a new. So let's open a new one with test. We should get an error. So let's go back to the debug modes. And you can see we got a test request and we got a 400. So this means it is working. This is what you expect. Now, the only thing that's missing is setting up the domain. And setting up the domain in Azure is a little bit more cumbersome than it should. We want to have our tagging server running on our own custom subdomain. So for that, we'll have go here and add a custom subdomain. And now we need to do a few things. We need to take the IP address of this machine and create an A record on our DNS system with this IP, and we need to do a TXT record with the domain verification ID, such that we can then add the custom domain and verify it. So in my particular case, my domain management is on Vercel. So that's what we're going to be using. I'm going to yank the IP. I'm going to go to Vercel. You should use a service that manages your domain. And we want an A record, TTL 7600, and the subdomain is metrics. Yes, let's make a comment, SGTM Azure. And we'll add, and also we need to add a TXT where we go back to Azure. Our value is going to be this verification ID, but our name is going to be ASUID and our subdomain. That's Azure TXT verification ID. And now we can then go here and add the custom domain. So this is going to be dependent on your provider. Our record type is an A record. As you can see, this is what it tells. Do not do the CNAME. The reason you shouldn't do the CNAME for Google Tag Manager is that some browsers, in particular Safari, they will reduce the time to live of your cookies to 7 days if the subdomain under which the tracking is in is under a CNAME record. Add a custom domain, just go to add custom domain and insert your domain, especially your subdomain. Select a record because we don't want it to be under a CNAME record. And this is what we need to input on our DNS to validate. We now add the custom domain. After this, we need to generate the SSL certificate. So we can use certbots, and we need to make a TXT record on our DNS to validate that certificate. So we copy the title and the value of that TXT records, and we add it into our own DNS records. Now that we have this done, we can now enter to continue the validation, and now we have our certificates. Now, Azure requires a different format for these certificates, so we're going to need to do some conversion. So let's make a sandbox, and let's go into the sandbox. Let's now copy everything from that folder where we have our PEM files, and let's convert to, let's change the ownership, and let's convert to the format that Azure accepts. This is the export password. Keep it because we're going to need it in Azure. After this, we go back to Azure, and in add binding, we can now add our own SSL certificate. So we select upload PIX file. We upload our own PIX file. We insert the password we defined earlier, and we just add. We wait a few moments, and it should be complete. And finally, we can test by going to metrics.pinemarsh.com/healthz, and we can see OK, which means that we now have GTM under our own custom domain. Now, one final thing, we need to pick up this URL and put it under our server-side container in GTM. So let's do that. Let's pick up the URL, just copy it. Let's open Google Tag Manager. And in here, we will select our container, our server-side container. We will go under container settings. and we will add the new custom domain under the URL. So we click on add URL and we add our new custom domain. Do not forget the HTTPS at the beginning. And we click save. And there we have it. And that's essentially it. We now have server-side GTM installed on Azure. Now, I know this isn't exactly a common use case, but I was having some issues and I needed to install on Azure. And I thought it would make a nice practical guide. It also helps us appreciate some of the things that Google automates away from us. It makes server-side GTM installation seem easy. I hope you have enjoyed the video. If so, please like and subscribe and comment on any doubts you might have had. I hope to see you again